Hey, so I'm going to talk a bit about life as a game, how this perspective can both reveal your limitations as well as provide a way out of those limitations, give you a way to expand what's possible for you. Now, I'm actually going to start the video with talking about the potential pitfalls of the perspective before we get into all the benefits. So I just want to make sure that you're not going to end up doing what I did and falling down sort of the trap of taking on this perspective. So, yeah, we're going to start there. Stay tuned and enjoy. For a long time, I took on the solipsistic point of view, got into consciousness, trying to understand consciousness, looking for a model to understand it and explain it. And solipsism seemed to make a lot of sense. And in that solipsism, there is a payoff. There's a payoff of looking at the world in a solipsistic way, which is if you're already looking to be selfish, looking at the world through a solipsistic lens, looking at life through that lens, gives you license, gives you justification to be selfish. So that, in part, is how I used it. Not wanting to take responsibility for my own life. Now, thankfully, I've gone through that. I've had the chance to experience that. So now, in talking about life, consciousness through the lens of a game, I don't have to repeat that pattern. Maybe I will. Maybe there's still some unconsciousness there around it. But I find the game metaphor really useful. There's a lot of analogs between a game and what's happening here, in my opinion. So if you think about how you approach life, right? How you, on a day-to-day basis, tackle life. Do you notice that it's like you're living in sort of a box? There's a routine that you undergo. There's a certain way that you might talk to people, certain topics that you don't want to touch on, maybe certain topics you don't want to touch on with certain people. Maybe there are people in your life who are close to you, right? Spouses, parents, siblings, I don't know, whoever, kids. And you notice that your body kind of tightens up around them, and it feels like there's a particular range of what you can and can't do when that person's in the room. And likewise, maybe you have a similar experience with people you don't know, right? Like, relatively speaking, your body is tighter or contracted in some way around those people, around people you don't know, and it feels lighter in certain ways around people that you do, people that you've shared intimacy or vulnerability with. So it can work in different ways. But the theme that runs constant through all of it is that there are limits to how we will express ourselves, to what we'll do and say, based upon the environment, based upon the people in that environment. And these limits are self-imposed. They have to be self-imposed, right? How can anyone else force you to limit yourself? Maybe the initial reason that you installed that software, so to speak, that you started limiting yourself in a particular way, was as a way to solve a problem. You're in an environment, probably when you were young, when you were a kid, in that environment, and the people in that environment presented problems that you didn't know how to solve otherwise. So you had to shut off parts of yourself. You had to learn to limit yourself in order to make the environment less painful, in order to survive. And you've carried that programming, that software, with you until today. So you're not really doing anything wrong per se. You're just running outdated software, outdated programming. So what if instead of your current understanding of life What if life was actually a game? Just an open world, massively multiplayer game, right? And maybe if you're a solipsist, if you believe you're the only one who exists, all the other players are NPCs, non-player characters, right? Fine. But what if life were a game? And you were fully aware that this was a game that you were playing, right? That the self that you're protecting by staying limited, by staying in that box, that self is actually code. It's an avatar through which you're able to show up in this game we're playing here on Earth. So if that were the case, would you limit yourself nearly as much, if at all? Maybe you still don't want to jump off a cliff because you want to keep playing the game. And rumor has it that if you jump off a cliff, it's a good chance the game's going to end. At least this version of it, right? But would you feel like you had to limit yourself the ways that you do in conversation? Would you limit yourself the ways that you do in your daily life through your routine? What is there that you really want to do that you won't let yourself do? Sing, dance, make some art, express yourself in a particular way. Be honest about something, about an aspect of yourself that you've been hiding, right? A lot of different possibilities there, but there's probably some way that you've been holding back because you're afraid. You're afraid of what the consequences will be, of how people will react. But if this were a game, just an open world game, and you were watching like from back here, it's like you knew that you were the one playing the game and that this body was the avatar through which you played the game, right? Was your character. Would you be quite so conservative in how you approach the game? Or would you take a few more seeming risks, right? So there's a disconnect between what you really need, which limits are actually useful to place on yourself, versus the limits that you actually do, right? I'll speak for myself. I notice my reluctance to put a video like this one online, to post to YouTube, to post to Facebook, to put myself out there. There's a reluctance, there's a limit. And there's a disconnect between the perceived risk of doing that, the perceived magnitude of the potential consequences, times the probability of those consequences, right? But there's a higher level of perceived danger compared to the actual danger, right, of doing it. And the same thing happens for me in conversations with people. I may feel in my body, or I may not even be aware of what's happening in my body, but there's that sense that something bad can happen, that I'll end up being threatened in some way. And this process is largely unconscious. It's like I'm being driven to behave in a certain way or not behave in a certain way, right? I'm being driven by unconscious programming, unconscious code. To put certain limits on myself so as to keep myself safe. And when I say myself in that context, what am I really talking about? it's a perception, it's a conceptual self. This self that I'm trying to protect, right? Because it's not just my body. It's not just the avatar, the character, the physical character, meat, blood, bone, that I'm trying to protect. I'm trying to protect my reputation. I'm trying to protect the people closest to me. I'm trying to make sure I keep my job, trying to avoid embarrassment. And perhaps all those things boil down to, if that happens, then I'm more likely to be killed. It's possible. I don't know for sure. But I think at the least, we might be able to admit that perceived danger level, there's a disparity between, say, being publicly embarrassed and the actual danger to my physical survival, the actual threat. There's a disconnect there. There's a high level of trying to avoid, to use the embarrassment example, to try to avoid embarrassment. There's a high amount of energy going into that program, that limitation program, that conditioning, to keep embarrassment away, to keep myself out of that situation. And I deaden my joy, I deaden my aliveness by doing that. So, if this were a game, what next? What could I do to train myself, to practice loosening that conditioning, those limitations? What could I do? And I think that the answer to that question is one to be discovered, not given, right? Not preached, because I just think we're all so unique. Our code, so to speak, is so unique. What's driving us is so unique. Our strengths and weaknesses, our proclivities, our talents, they're all so unique that I can't tell you what experiments or what actions to take, what to do about your programming, what to do about loosening those limitations. What I can share is a bit of how I'm looking to approach my own. And this is part of it. Just putting this up is part of it. It's a big part of it, actually, because this is a big part of what I've wanted to do, to put myself out there in a way where I can actually connect with like-minded people more easily, and just to be able to share some ideas, to share of myself. But the perceived risk has been high. And I think this is one of those examples where you get through it by doing it. Sometimes I think there's the answer is pretty straightforward, where you can work at loosening the limitation simply by doing, by just jumping off the perceived cliff, right? Running right into the fear and doing it anyway is one way. But what I've found is that I've done this so many times, like not actually posting, but like posting once or twice and then getting a lack of feedback that I'm looking for, a lack of validation, and then stopping. I've noticed that quite a few times. So there's a few things happening there. One is trying to step off the ledge, or putting a toe in the pool. Maybe that's a better metaphor. Putting the toe in the pool and then being like, no, this is too cold. And pulling back out, right? Waiting for the water to be warm enough. But what happens is eventually you acclimate. So over the years, I've been slowly acclimating, you could say. And part of that acclimation process hasn't just been through exposure, or else I don't know that I'd be here willing to try again. I haven't necessarily succeeded. I'm just recording the video right now. But part of it, for me, has been learning to see my own code, learning to better understand myself, what my code is doing, what my programming is doing, why it's doing that. What's the benefit of me behaving the way that I behave? And a lot of this is so challenging because we're not aware of what we're really doing. Growth, if we could use that word. Maybe a deconstructive word is better. Seeing your code and working with it creatively, right? Expansion, freedom. Gaining freedom in this game called life. Gaining freedom is so challenging because we can be so unaware. We tend to be, as humans, so unaware of what's really running us, of what's really driving our behavior. And we tell ourselves stories about what we're doing that may or may not be accurate, right? We justify, we rationalize our behavior. We hide what we're really doing. We hide our true motives from ourselves. Wow. But it sets up a really interesting challenge because it makes knowing yourself into a really interesting sub-game that you could play. Just simply knowing yourself, knowing what you're really up to, knowing what really makes you tick, knowing your truest desires. Getting to know that is a journey. It's its own sub-game. And isn't that beautiful? Isn't that amazing? That this is set up in such a way, the human experience is set up in such a way that we ourselves, getting to know ourselves, we are the journey. I am my own sub-game that I can play. Learning myself is its own game. Wow. That's amazing. I don't have to go anywhere to play the game. To play what I think is the most interesting game on earth. And as part of that game, I can create my own mini games, right? Like, for instance, when that comes to mind, I haven't played this one yet, but I'm afraid of heights. So I might want to create a mini game where I'm pushing that boundary in a safe way. You know, I don't want to do it in a way where I'm really at risk to fall. But maybe just walking up to a cliff edge and feeling where I'm getting afraid. And then there are some processes for how I might work with that fear that I can get into later. But, you know, that type of game where I'm exposing myself to it. So that's a sub-game in the larger game of learning myself. In gaining more freedom. Part of what's so beautiful about this game is that it's going to look different for each person because there's a uniqueness to each of us, right? If you've been into, teachings about consciousness or enlightenment, you may have heard stuff around how we're all one, how your nature is undifferentiated consciousness, right? Unconditioned consciousness. And I think that there's a sameness to that can be a little bit deceiving. That's lends itself to misunderstanding. Lends itself to us ignoring our own uniqueness, right? And then part of the consequence of that might be that we adopt paths that aren't for us. And that's all well and good if you're just trying something out the way that you try a flavor of ice cream and then you find that you don't like the ice cream and then you stop eating the ice cream. But in this case, you might try one flavor of ice cream because Guru Baba says, says that, this is the ice cream. This is the one true ice cream. And this will lead you to enlightenment, right? So we keep eating vanilla ice cream over and over and over again, stubbornly, because Guru Baba says, this is the ice cream. This is the one true ice cream. So I don't know. I don't find that very effective. For myself, I mean, your mileage may vary. You might be someone who's eaten one flavor of ice cream for a lot of years and be like, yeah, that's the ice cream. I found it right away. But is it the ice cream because someone else told you it was ice cream, or is that just dumb luck? Uh, or maybe it's not dumb luck. Maybe it's life working for you. I think there is a certain cheekiness, playfulness to life. Like life's on your side, but a little bit of a tangent. I think definitely for myself, but I suspect for most of us, we got to try a few different flavors of ice cream and be willing to ditch the ones that don't work for us. But in our limitations, our self-imposed limitations, a big part of what happens to many of us is that we learn that we shouldn't really trust ourselves. Really shouldn't trust our own palate. We trust the guru's palate. We trust our parents' palates. We trust what they tell us to do. The ways that they give us that are handed down. So we don't trust ourselves to taste the ice cream and say, okay, this ice cream sucks. I don't want to eat this ice cream. I need to find a different ice cream. And not to lose track of the metaphor, what I'm really talking about here is there's an analogy, but regardless, what I'm really talking about here are ways to come back to yourself, ways to learn about yourself, and ways to move through the challenges that our own limitations present. That's a unique journey for each of us, and I think that really is something to be respected, not fought against, because that's just like another layer of limitation, right? Like, I shouldn't be this way. Adds additional stress to the system. Instead of being like, oh, okay, this is the way I am. How do I work with this? What's a creative way to work with this? And being willing to fly in the face of seeming authority figures can be really helpful. As can acquiescing, right? Maybe your pattern is one where you're always rebelling. If someone tells you to do something a certain way, you instantly don't want to do it that way. They say, hey, maybe you want to try some vanilla, and you go, fuck vanilla. You're not going to tell me what ice cream to taste. Fuck you. So, that comes back to the uniqueness point, right? You got to get the sense of what your way of doing life is, what your particular limitations are. And your limitation might look like, no one's going to tell me what to do. And then I continue to push people away, and I won't take any advice. It's like I'm too self-reliant in a way, right? Because I won't let anything in. I got to figure it out for myself, or else what, right? So, if that's you, that's a real question, or else what? What's going to happen if you let other people lead you a bit? If you follow other people's advice? What's that mean for you? Anyway, just saying, it can look really different for all of us, and that's something that's worth coming to terms with, because it gets a bit more fun when you're willing to meet yourself where you're at, be honest about what's real for you, and then create and or play games that suit you. These mini games, these sub games that suit you in the larger game of getting to know yourself, of having a more enjoyable life. Of doing the things that you've longed to do, that you've really wanted, that feed your soul, that feel just like a huge yes, that you lose time when you're doing them. You just love doing them for their own sake, not because there's a goal to meet or a standard to achieve. Because when it comes down to it, life, if we're looking at it through this lens of life as a game, it's not a game with predetermined goals, predetermined quests. You have full freedom to determine your own goals, to determine your own quests. It's open world, and there are no rules other than maybe some physical ones, some rules that come with being where we are, being on Earth, being human, right? Maybe there are some limits there, some physical limits, but I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe that's my own limitation. I can't say for sure because it's that mysterious what's happening here, right? We don't really know what's going on. And you get to decide for yourself what games you want to play here. You get to determine that. And what can happen is that we play games we don't even know we're playing. Like, be a doctor because my parents wanted me to, or make sure not to do anything embarrassing in conversations, or make sure that people don't tell me what to do, make sure that I'm the one coming up with all the ideas of how I live my life. We can play whatever games we want, and many of the games we're already playing we're not aware of. We don't remember starting them, deciding to play them. Games like, speaking to myself, games like, how many ways can I possibly be wrong right now? Right? Games like looking at a person's face and trying to see every time that it looks like they're not liking what you're saying, that you're doing something wrong. Playing that game, right? Oh, I'm not sure if I said the right thing there. Ooh, and it's a painful game to play. I'm really speaking to my own experience now. And why would I play that game? This unconscious game that I didn't know I was playing. Why would I play that game? Because whenever I see something that I might be doing wrong, I have the chance to correct it. I have the chance to try to manipulate the other person into liking me as a way to stay safe, as a way to make sure that they won't attack me, that the village at large won't attack me. And for me, it ultimately comes down to it seems to come down to bodily harm and unconscious fear. Like, they won't like me. I'll end up getting arrested is one for me. I'll end up getting arrested and going to jail, and then I'll get raped and brutalized in jail, and bodily fear. I'll be annihilated. I'll be in pain. And that's why I play this game, where I look at the world and see all the ways that I'm doing it wrong. And that becomes my world, right? That's my perception, is like, I'm someone doing life wrong. I'm doing life wrong and I gotta fix it. But I'll never get there, because the point of that setup isn't for me to actually solve the problem. It isn't for me to actually do it right. That's not the point of the game. The point of the game is to keep me safe. So if the game ended, if I actually got to the end of the game and was like, oh, okay, I'm now officially doing everything right. I've proven to myself that I'm doing everything right. I've covered all the bases. I'm good. If I got to the end, that I wouldn't be playing the game anymore, and now I'm no longer safe. Now people can get me because I'm no longer going to be aware of when they turn, of when they are not pleased with what I'm saying. I'm going to miss it, and then they're going to hurt me. So the point of the game, that unconscious game that I'm playing, isn't to actually get to the end of the game. The point of the game is actually to keep playing the game forever. For as long as I'm alive, if I don't become conscious of that game, I'm going to play it until the day I die. Because that code will keep running. It is self-sustaining. And it's in service of survival of the self. And ultimately, from what I can tell, in service of survival of the physical body. although it's happening in thought. It's living in this mental, non-existent world, right? Where people are mad at me when they're really not, right? It's happening in this mind matrix. And yet it seems to boil down to, oh, I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to get raped. I don't want to get killed. And it's a self-sustaining program. And it actually serves this character better if the program stays unconscious. It serves the character better because then there's no chance of me dismantling it. There's no chance of me looking to free myself from that program. And even though that program causes me to be more in the box, to live a less joyful, less exuberant, less exciting life, it's trying to protect me. And survival is going to trump excitement. Survival is going to trump fun. It's going to trump joy. It's going to trump living to the fullest extent, to living out your truest desires. Survival is going to trump all of that stuff. So again, let's review the setup here, right? There is an unconscious program happening in service of self-survival. It's a self-perpetuating program. It doesn't want to be found. It serves the self better if the program isn't found, isn't brought into consciousness, conscious awareness. It serves the self better, in the self's opinion, right? Like, I hide it from myself. So, if I want more freedom, if I want to live a fuller life, how do I deal with this challenge? If I want to live a fuller life, how do I deal with this challenge where I'm actually not in control the way I thought I was? The stories I tell myself about, oh, I did this and that. I said this because I didn't want to be rude, right? I didn't say that because I didn't want to be rude, right? I told that guy to go fuck off because he's being an asshole, right? These stories and the rationalizations and all of that, the way I tell my story, is actually in service of keeping these programs hidden, right? Of perpetuating the self that I'm already being. This particular one, this particular shape that I'm taking through my limitations. Everything I do is in service of that, and is in service of the persistence of that self, the survival of that self, the survival of the code, the unconscious programs. It's all in service of that. So how do I deal with the challenge of that I'm hiding these things from myself if I want to live a freer, more joyous life? And I would say it looks probably, first off, it looks different for everybody. The particulars of that, the specifics of that look different for everybody. Person A, Bob might like breath work. Susie might like yoga. Janet might want to do some self-inquiry. Bruce wants to meditate. And George draws. George just draws his heart out. He just draws and draws and draws. And I don't know all the different ways it could look. It seems to me like there are infinite possibilities and combinations of possibilities of how coming back to ourselves, learning our own terrain, our own mental and emotional terrain, and then working through the challenges of this unconscious programming, how that can look. They can look infinite different ways, right? As many ways as there are people. But there probably are some underlying principles to how that looks. I suspect, and I'm willing to be wrong on this, but I suspect that part of how it looks is we need to become aware of what we're doing. We need to become aware of what's really going on. What's actually happening here? What game am I playing? What game am I playing, and why am I playing it? What's the purpose of playing it? And if I can become aware of the pattern, the program, and why I'm doing it, there's a few possibilities there that weren't before. One possibility is I can see in real time when I continue to engage in that pattern or program. A. B. I can start to be honest with myself about the payoff, which is typically emotional. I might not want to feel something, right? Instead, I want to blame someone else for what I'm feeling, or I want to try to get away from something I'm feeling. Like I gave the example of making myself wrong as a way to avoid, ultimately, pain, hurt, physical hurt, and fear. So there's a payoff to continuing to make myself wrong. I get to avoid feeling something. So I get to be honest about that, right? Be honest about what's really there underneath the surface, unconscious fear, right? So now I have a kind of a compass. And I've experienced this with my own sadness, is how much grief I've had, right? That I wasn't aware of. So I get to meet the emotions that are lurking under the surface. And that is something that the self that wants to survive wants to avoid. Doesn't want it, like it's getting along well enough in its own opinion. Life in the status quo, life in the box is good enough. I'm not dead, so let's just keep on this way. It doesn't want to meet these emotions. So part of the process is making the programs conscious, meeting the emotions under the surface, which the self wants to avoid, but is actually a really beautiful process in my experience so far. It feels like coming home to yourself. And can I meet my own needs? Like, there's an unconscious need there. Can I meet my needs? Now, in the example I gave, I'm talking about fear. Maybe meeting my need looks like becoming friends with my fear, right? Because I'm trying to avoid my fear. So instead, can I become friends with it? Can I get to know it better? Can I learn how to move with it? And maybe this is where I start creating some games to help me there. Like I talked about moving to the edge of a cliff. Maybe I take up martial arts. Who knows, right? I can get creative about how I do that. But can I start to become conscious of my unconscious needs and then meet those? So I imagine that any type of healing process, which is, I think, a necessary part of becoming more free, is healing our wounds. It's going to look something like that. So there might be some underlying principles there. And then it can just look at, a million different ways, or 7 billion, 8 billion different ways. Different combinations of methodologies and things we do, ways we can get creative. And I guess that's the last point I want to make, is on creativity, because what happened for me is that I got really into the whole consciousness, spirituality thing, and enlightenment, and the idea that enlightenment looks a particular way, which may or may not be true. I don't know. I don't ascribe to being enlightened, but I can say that there was a negative consequence of that, or maybe not a negative consequence, but a sort of limitation that I wasn't seeing. And that was, this needs to look this way. My process needs to look this way. My process needs to look like sitting and meditating, right? If I'm not being quiet, if I'm not being still, if I'm not being peaceful, I'm doing it wrong, right? So that keeps joy and aliveness kind of at arm's length, doesn't it? It says peace is good, but exuberance, I'm not so sure about, right? It doesn't really fit into the model that I had taken on. So this leads me back to creativity, because that view on consciousness, on enlightenment, on awakening, it leaves out. It's a very dry view. It can be a very dry way of looking at things. That's my experience. And what if we really opened it up? Like, that's one possibility, is to sit and meditate. One possibility to really sit and soak in the silence. underlying all the activity. That's one possibility. And maybe some other possibilities include using life, right? Using the fact that I'm here in a physical body as a way to work through the challenges of my conditioning. That's a possibility that, believe it or not, I lost for a while, that I made myself blind to. Probably because it's scary to do that, right? There are things in the physical world that I am trying to avoid. That's the whole point of the programming in a lot of ways, isn't it? To try to avoid certain experiences. So therefore, there is an unconscious benefit to latching onto the, I'm going to sit in the fucking lotus position in a cave and enlighten myself without having to interact with the world, interact with people. It's actually an unconscious avoidance of fear, of the world, of people. So if you're in that place right now, I would encourage you to look at the possibility of using the world as a way to move through your conditioning, to process things, to make games out of it, right? Like, you're not here in a physical body to ignore the fact that you're in a physical body, in my opinion. There's a lot of possibility here that gets shut off when you ascribe to the, only meditation, only self-inquiry kind of path. So there's just a lot more possibility here than maybe you're currently seeing if you're in that place right now of, that very dry kind of view on what consciousness is and how to achieve enlightenment. So anyway, yeah, I think that's good for now. Thanks.